The rectangular grid is an ancient city plan and has been used by civilizations for thousands of years. And it underpins many of our cities to this day. From San Francisco to Chicago, from Savannah to Seattle, and from Manhattan all the way to Barcelona. The grid has been hailed for its efficiency and organizing a city with ease. The man who was so often attributed with the prevalence of the grid layout is Hippodamus of Miletus from ancient Greece, otherwise known as the supposed father of urban planning. While he did not invent the city grid, his redesign of the city, Piraeus, in the 5th century BC set in motion a plan that would take over cities for centuries to come. And there are valid reasons why it has become one of the most popular designs. The grid plan is arguably one of the most efficient plans for optimizing space. It creates square or rectangular lots that make it easier to sell or build on, and land disputes over property decreases when it is parceled off in these blocks. The modern-day grid provides access to cars and pedestrians. It encourages the population to flock to city centers and navigate the city with ease. Whether you're a local or just a visitor, a gridded city system means you're probably less likely to get lost. The grid is also thought to promote equality, as all blocks are shaped and sized equally. This was the thinking that William Penn had in his design for Philadelphia, one of the earliest American cities and a place that much of America's later cities were modeled upon. A grid just seems to make sense. But there is a surprising dark side to the city grid. It's been said that grids are no coincidence. And some actors throughout history have employed the use of the grid not for good, but for undiluted power and control. So, what is the darkness that underlies our city grids, and how might the grid be bad for us today? Let's go all the way back to the days of the Roman Empire, when a vast network of grids spread across Europe and parts of Asia and Africa. There is little evidence of gridded cities before the empire gained a foothold in the region, but when it did, a rapid spread of the gridded system throughout the Roman colonies took place. Just take a look at the ruins of a Roman grid in what is now Timgad, Algeria. The grid in the Roman Empire seems to have been largely planned and deployed as a means to fuel economic growth and expansion. The grid may have been the most logical way for the Romans to organize the new territory they gained, therefore creating a place to absorb newly conquered people into its rule. Basically, while the soldiers were defending its borders on the outside, control was maintained on the inside. One professor takes these ideas a step further. Dr. Jill L. Grant argues that some of the most tyrannical regimes in history, committed to monopolizing power, have used the grid to establish their mark on the landscape. So, could our grid cities really be rooted in tyranny? Again, take the Roman Empire for example. She makes the case that they used the grid to physically manifest their global authority within the empire. She states, while wealth and resources were funneled to Rome and regional capitals, the colonial towns helped disseminate Roman culture and integrate distant lands into the empire. If we jump forward in time and look at how the US expanded westward, we see the use of the grid as a way to efficiently survey and distribute the land to new settlers. Land was a valued commodity, and the grid was a technique for settlers who facilitated control of a landscape wrested from its indigenous inhabitants. Thomas Jefferson issued several land ordinances in the 1780s, specifically establishing gridded towns in new territories purchased from indigenous tribes in places like Ohio. This could also be viewed as an act of geometric repression, or a way to master nature through control and neutralization of the wild environment. Take the western settlement of Salt Lake City, Utah, founded in 1847, as another example. It has some of the largest blocks of any city grid system in the United States. As Angelo Baca and Erica Basumic argued in the Salt Lake Tribune, this grid system and other city planning decisions made by the early settlers were imposed upon lands and indigenous communities who were eventually removed, sometimes through violent means. In Grant's research, she concludes that the grid is not inherently evil, but its strong historical association with colonization, centralization, and globalization gives pause for thought. But is the grid really bad for you to this day? Let's start by taking a look at one of the most famous city grids, Manhattan. Early Manhattan was dirty, disorganized, and vulnerable to disease. The grid plan, formerly known as the Commissioner's Plan, was approved in 1811 and seemed to be the perfect solution. And the grid became a way to further increase the value of the land. Completed by the end of the 19th century, it has been praised and hated by many. It has been called the most courageous act of prediction in Western civilization, and the best manifestation of American pragmatism in the creation of urban form. Yet, critiques of the grid include Professor Peter Marcuse from Columbia University, who said Manhattan's grid is one of the worst city plans of any major city in the developed countries of the world. He also noted that the grid is shorthand for gridiron, the medieval torture rack. There are those, like Walt Whitman, who watched Manhattan transform before their very eyes. In 1849, he wrote, "The elevated and stony grounds about here will cost their owners dearly to get them graded and paved in the monotonous style required by most of our American cities. I always think it a pity that greater favor is not given to the natural hills and slopes of the ground on the upper part of Manhattan Island. Our perpetual dead flat and streets cutting each other at right angles are certainly the last things in the world consistent with beauty of situation." The Manhattan grid created dense urban developments that lack sunlight and fresh air. As a result, it is criticized as unhygienic, especially as Manhattan became more crowded, dirty, and prone to outbreaks of disease by the early 20th century. The New York housing historian, Dr. Richard Plunz, wrote that the solar orientation of the gridiron was reversed from the ideal. Had the long dimension of each block faced east-west, both front and rear facades of each house would have received sunlight each day. Instead, south facades got and get all the sun, north facades none. Another problem with the grid is simply geometrical. The most efficient route between 2 points is a straight line. Yet, the grid forces us to travel across town in a series of arguably inefficient 90-degree angle turns. There's also evidence that a monotonous cityscape can have negative effects on our sense of happiness and well-being. As Colin Ellard, an environmental psychologist and neuroscientist, said in Eon magazine, "There is every reason to believe that these sterile, homogeneous environments are exerting a measurable effect on our behavior, and likely our brains as well." Ellard noted that there is evidence that boring environments can generate stress, impulsivity, lowered levels of positive affect, and risky behavior. The grid was supposed to at least solve these problems from the early days of New York. Yet instead, it created controversy. Today, there are plenty of studies to back up those critiques. Research shows us that spending time in nature is good for humans. Even just implementing more urban green spaces in our cities has been shown to not only improve mental health, but also reduce cardiovascular issues, obesity, risk of type 2 diabetes, and improve pregnancy outcomes. So, is there a solution to the ires of the modern city? The first solution, incorporated into federal regulatory documents in the 1930s, was the cul-de-sac, planned for a new neighborhood layout that included curvy loops and streets. We know them as our modern suburbs. During the post-war building boom, access to mortgages was conditional upon adopting these new federal standards. Millions of homes were built on loops and cul-de-sacs in the post-war decades. It's important to note that these new housing guidelines were rooted in racism and contributed to segregation and practices like redlining, effects that echo to this day. But they solved some issues, like increasing proximity to nature and allowing households to be largely isolated from through traffic on their streets. But the plan has been criticized extensively as the U.S. increasingly becomes a suburban nation, as these neighborhoods and its disconnected streets demands a dependence on cars, most concerningly leading to an acceleration of climate change. Could the answer even possibly be in a hexagonal city grid? It was at one point in time a competing city plan with the cul-de-sac. Hexagonal city plans have been found in comparative analyses to be pretty safe, increase exposure to direct sunlight, and improve travel efficiency. But it's a rare city plan, found to be more commendable on paper than in actual practicality. Yet we can look to Barcelona, Spain, to see how they are adapting their existing grid plan to better cater to humans and the environment. The city has begun implementing a series of superblocks, condensing several small blocks to a bigger one, effectively cutting access to cars and creating more space for humans to gather and play. It's just one of the ways planners are figuring out how to mold cities to the demands of a modern, more human-friendly world. Ultimately, no city plan is perfect, and the grid is no exception. Solutions to the city grid will continue to be sought after by designers with utopian aspirations for generations to come. After all, nothing defines our lives in so many ways more permanently than our streets. So, what do you think is the most ideal city plan? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to click the bell so you'll be notified whenever we release a new video. Thanks for watching.